Welcome, everybody. I want to thank the hosts, Rabbi Strachler and Rinat Yisrael, and of course, Czion and Megaloz for hosting this event and for inviting me to speak. I'm going to try to stick to the time. I've been given a little more time, so I think for me it's really going to be mechayev. All right, so this shiur is obviously dedicated in memory of Mori Rabbi Harvar and Lichatzin Zatzal. I didn't hear this particular piece of Torah from him, but inasmuch as, along with so many other Talmidim, I was shaped and molded in so many ways by Mori Rabbi, I feel that to the extent that any Torah I teach or disseminate is worthy, it's really attributable to him ultimately. And in the end, I'll have something to say about him too, about him and his piece of Torah from him as well, just in the concluding remarks. The topic that I chose for the shiur is the debate over Sefirat HaOmer in the absence of Mikdash, which is the point of departure, of course, of the Gemara Menachos, which presents a machlokes. Amar Rabbi, in source number 1, mitzvah mimne yumei, mitzvah mimne shvuei. So Rabbi is discussing how we count Sefirat HaOmer, and he says that the mitzvah requires us to count both days and weeks, as is our common practice. This is based on the clear psukim. There are two parshios where the topic of Sefirat HaOmer comes up in the Torah. The first, in source number 2, in Parshas Emor, speaks explicitly of counting days. It says, etc. And then in Pasuk Tazayin, Yom. So the Pasuk says explicitly count days. Then you bring the Sheilechem. While the Psukim in Parshas RAL, in source number 3, speak explicitly of counting weeks. Shiva Shavuos Esporlach, Tachel Espor Shiva Shavuos. So Abai says quite reasonably, the mitzvah requires that we count both days and weeks, again, as our common practice. And this, the Gemara notes, was practiced by the great majority of the Rabbanim there, Rabbanan de Be'er Vashi, Manu Yomei, Manu Shavuei. However, the Gemara says, there is a dissenting opinion, Ameimar, the Gemara quotes his practice before it quotes his explanation. It quotes his position was, what he did himself, he only counted days. Ameimar mani yume velo mani shavuah. He didn't count the weeks. Why not? The Gemara explains, Amar, he explained his position. Apparently he was asked about it. Zechel Mikdash. It's only Zechel Mikdash. What does this mean? So the vast majority of Rishonim take the position of Rashi, which means as follows, that Amar, this is Rashi source number 4, Hai minyana dahashta, the minyan, the counting that we do today, lav chovahu. There's no chiyuv, meaning minat Torah. There's no obligation deoraisa to count today. Deha leka omer, because there's no omer. We're not bringing makriv. We don't bring the korban omer that we are supposed to on Pesach. The pasuk, after all, if you look in source number 2, the pasuk speaks of the count as being triggered by it's supposed to start. The first day of the count is supposed to be the day that you bring the omer on Tezayin Nisan. Right, that's the day that you count, and inasmuch as we don't have the, unfortunately, Haviyachem is Omer Tenufa today, we don't bring the Omer, so then there's no mitzvah of Sefirat. Sefirat starts with Haviyachem as Omer. We're not bringing the Omer, and therefore the mitzvah deoraisa of Sefirat does not apply. Ella, so what we do in fact count, even he counts, Ella Zechel Mikdash Ba'amahu. It's simply Zechel Mikdash. So this is a mitzvah midirabanan. The Rabbanan instituted to commemorate Mikdash, that we count even today, even though there's no Omer. And since, says Rashi, says Ameimar, Hilchach, inasmuch as it's only a dirabanan zechel and mikdash, biyomei sagi, it's sufficient, it suffices to count simply the days. We're simply trying to commemorate a practice that was performed, the mitzvah that's performed in the time of the Mikdash. For that purpose, it's enough to simply count the days. You don't need to do the whole thing in its perfection, just as long as there's something that is evoking the memory that is meant to commemorate the Mikdash, so that's sufficient. So you can count days, you don't need to count the weeks as well. This is the position of Ameimar. The question becomes, first, we're going to come back to Ameimar, but just briefly, I'll just first discuss what is Abai's reaction to this. What is Abai's position? Ameimar's position that we only count the days boils down to two propositions, to two premises. He argues, number 1, that the mitzvah, as I've discussed, is only Zechel Mikdash and not Midoraisa. And number 2, given that it's only Midirabanan and not Midoraisa, it's sufficient to count the days. regarding what Abaye holds, here we find the Machlokas Rishonim, which premise of these two positions, of these two premises that HaMeimar is based upon, does Abaye disagree? There are some Rishonim who make clear that they think that Abaye's argument is on the first premise of HaMeimar, namely, HaMeimar who held that this mitzvah is dependent upon Omer, and therefore is only Bizman Hazeh, B'dirabanan, they think that Abaye disagrees with that. This is evidently the position of the Rambam, implied in the Rambam, in source number 5. The Rambam writes, mitzvahs aseh, lispor sheva, shabashos, timimos, etc., halacha chavdalad, mitzvah zo, akol ish me'Yisrael, b'chol makom, uv'chol zman. So the mitzvah of counting the Omer is applicable to all people, but in all ages, in all times, regardless, apparently, of whether or not there's a Beis Mikdash and whether or not there's Hakravas HaOmer. Apparently, the mitzvah is always de oraisa. What is implied in the Rambam is explicit in a younger contemporary of Meir Halevi, or the Ramah of Abulafia. He writes in a correspondence that he had with the Rosh Rishon, which considered a number of different topics, but this is one of them, Sefirat HaOmer. He writes explicitly, like in support of the Rambam, he thinks that even though the HaOmer says Zeichel Mikdash, HaOmer Savar Midirbanan, V'Abaye Savar Midaraisa. Abaye's position is that that premise is wrong. What does he do with the Psukim? After all, the Pasuk does seem to indicate, right, Miyom Aviachem. So basically what the Ramah suggests is V'Abaye Savar Midaraisa, V'Imishum Nechsiv Miyom Aviachem, etc. Tisperu, Hahimi Bailes. He quotes a brisa which explains what it means is Shetehei Hava B'Yom Sfira. Shetehei Sfira Belel Shisha Asar Benisan, meaning the Yom Haviachem doesn't mean the actual bringing of the Omer. It's the same date that you're supposed to bring the Omer, which is the second day of Pesach, Tezai Nisan. The same date is supposed to be the day that you start your Sfira. So it doesn't mean actually Mi Haviachem is Omer Tenufa. It doesn't mean you have to actually bring your Omer in order to then proceed to have to count. It's the day in which you would bring the Omer. So even if you're not in fact bringing the Omer before, you still count Midoraisa, you count Sefirat HaOmer. That's the position of the Rambam, the Ramah. There are a couple others here and there, including Ravia, who believe this as well. However, most Rishonim seem to disagree with this. Most Rishonim take the position that Abaye, in arguing upon HaMeimar, accepts HaMeimar's contention that this is only a mitzvah dirabanan in the absence of Mikdash, in the absence of Omer. It really is dependent min haTorah upon the bringing of the Omer. What they disagree with is the implication. According to a HaMeimar who thinks, well, if that's the case, it's only midirabanan. You could just count Yamim and leave out Shavuos. That's where they disagree. They think it's only dirabanan and it's only Zeichel Mikdash, but you count both. That they accept that this is midirabanan is explicit already, represented in the Tosfos Alatari Menachos, when he writes that Zeichel Mikdash, he says, Tosfos says that this fact that it is in fact that the Sefirat HaOmer is in fact midirabanan, Zeichel Mikdash, is the reason why you can conduct yourself a certain way, namely that besavek hashecha bizman ben hashmashos, when it's considered to be a time which is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. We don't really have a Deoraisa Vadai description of it as being either Yom or Laila. It's Safek Yom, Safek Laila. So for Safek Derabanan Lekula, right, you can rely on the Safek Derabanan in order to be Mekil if it's a Derabanan. So we allow you to count Ben Hashmashos. We allow you to count after Shkia, even though Rabbanim usually say you should count again after Tzeis. So that's being machmir for something that the Tosa say, minadin, you can rely on the fact that Zerabanan you can count just after Shkia. This is what they say. Near the Besavik HaShecha, Yachol Avarech, Ve'ein Tzarech Lahamtin Achi He Vada Laila. You don't have to wait till Tzeis HaKochavim. Kevan Shu Sveka Derabanan. Inasmuch as the Gemara explains, it's only Zeichel Mikdash, it's only Derabanan. So therefore we can rely on this in order to count Me'ikar Din. You can count after Shkia, and you don't have to, if you're going to count again, you shouldn't count with the bracha. The Smag, the Ramosha Mekutzi, codifies this and emphasizes how this is so, even though we don't paskin like a HaMeimar regarding what we count, but the premise, the proposition that he explicitly articulates, that it's Zeichel Mikdash, that it's only Derabanan, that is accepted. Right? This is the source number 8. Valacha Kirabanan de Ravashi. So we paskin, you need to count days and weeks. But the case of Rabbeinu Shimshon Rabbi Avram, so he quotes a great Rash Mishans, the fact that, as our HaMeimar articulated explicitly, this is only Derabanan Zeichel Mikdash, so that does take effect, that does have impact, not in necessarily how we count days alone versus days and weeks, but it has impact even, again, with the Abaye, So they hold that this is a dirabanan, this is a kuliyama dirabanan. Abaye accepts that it's dirabanan. Elamai, so the disagreement is, given that it's dirabanan, is it therefore is it sufficient to count days, or do we have to count days and weeks? The position of HaOmer is you only need to count the days, and the position of Abaye is it's dirabanan, but you have to count the days and the weeks. And here I want to focus on that particular element of the debate. The question of, given that it's dirabanan, do you count only days or days and weeks? Because the truth is, if you consider HaOmer, yeah?
The reason why you assume that Tosfos is holding like Abaye and not HaOmer?
Yeah. Because, again, well, the Smag is explicit about it. I guess in theory, one could question, I haven't seen anybody actually paskin HaOmer in this debate. And the Balei Tosfos who are quoted, who are presumably being quoted and represented in the Tosfos Shalanu and Menachos, so they're to the extent that we have sort of an inkling of who said this and when and who and where. So the other Balei Tosfos, they quote them as being, despite the fact that we paskin like Abaye. So for instance, the Smag here, the Rosh attributes it to the Ri. So it's pretty early on where what appears on our Tosfos is explicitly stated that this is despite the fact that we paskin that you count Yomi V'Shuoi. But the two questions that I want to raise on HaOmer and discuss, which will occupy most of the rest of the time here, which is number one, why not, given that it's dirabanan, why not count the Shavuos too? Why leave out the Shavuos? So granted, this is only dirabanan, and it's Zeichel Mikdash, but what exactly is the advantage? What is the reason why we would just simply leave out the Shavuos? Right? So granted, the mitzvah min Torah, which says Yamim and Shavuos, that doesn't apply anymore, and we're only doing it Zeichel Mikdash. But why not Zeichel Mikdash count the days and the weeks? This question was articulated in Tzvas Emes, and he notes it as just something that is puzzling. Temehani delo matzinu kazeh, demabechach de Zeichel Mikdashi, lama lo naaseh b'shleimus kemosha asu b'zman hamikdash. Why wouldn't we simply do it the way they do it in the Mikdash? Granted, it's not min Torah, but what's the second proposition here? Hilchach b'yom esagi. Why? That's number one. The Ramah was so bothered by this, I don't have time to get into it, but the Ramah was so bothered by this problem that he reanalyzes HaOmer. He suggests that we don't have time to go into this, but he basically suggests that HaOmer really also agrees that Yamim are days. He only thinks Shavuos are Zeichel Mikdash, and maybe he just doesn't hold of Zeichel Mikdash here. But why? Why can't you read it normally like we saw, that it's Yamim? He thinks that the whole mitzvah is Zeichel Mikdash, and he only counts days because of that. It was precisely this point. He doesn't understand how you could say that. Di'a Yomi Nami, this is source number 10, the last line, the second to last line. Di'a Yomi Nami, if HaOmer also argues on Yamim, meaning that HaOmer thinks that both days and weeks are Zeichel Mikdash and not enforced today, Im Kain, Mashna Yami, the Havimani Zeichel Mikdash, Mashna Shavui, the Lo Havimani Zeichel Mikdash. Why, if the whole thing is midrabanan now because there's no Mikdash, so then why, when we commemorate the Mikdash, do we only count the days and not the weeks? Why would you leave him out? That's number one. Number two, the question is not just why not count the weeks, but really how can we leave out the weeks? How is it valid for the Takana D'Rabbanan to simply leave an element out of the mitzvah? We have a general principle, actually, that refers, that relates to Takanos D'Rabbanan, that called the Tikkun Rabbanan Ke'ein De'oraisa Tiknu. Whenever the Rabbanan were metaking, whenever they instituted their own, they legislated laws, so they followed the pattern of the Torah law. So this comes up in various places. I quote two examples just to give you a sense of the implications of this principle. The first relates to, the first example I'm quoting in source number 11, relates to the din of a tvila for an adam tahor that is nichnas la'azara. So the Mishnah in Yoma says that ein adam nichnas la'azara la'avoda afilu tahor at sheyitbol. Person has to, before he goes into the azara, to the courtyard of the Mikdash, he has to do tvila. Now, normally speaking, tvila is required for somebody who's tameh, right? That person, it's usher to enter and to do avodah the Mikdash tameh. So for that reason, a person who is entering into the Mikdash, he has to be tovel first. But the Mishnah says you even have to do tvila even if you know that you're tahor. And the Gemara explains in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the basis for this is Tvilo Zolama, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Sarach Tvilo Hizo. This is simply a kind of a Dirabanan Tvila. Kadesha Yiskor Tuma Yishana Shabiyad Avir. It's a precaution in case somebody out there would once, just sort of unthinkingly, assuming he's tahor, enter the Mikdash. So we make sure that we take a moment, precaution, first do Tvila this way at least, in case a person actually remembers, you know what, maybe I am, in fact, tahor, tameh, he'll be able to do the tefillah. Basically, it's a precaution to ensure that we'll have purity, even though it doesn't min Torah apply. It's a sarach tefillah just as a precaution. Okay, so the question that the Gemara addresses in source number 12 is regarding such a tefillah, the Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's only sarach tefillah, it's only tefillah derabanan, is the din of chatzitza applicable? Gemara says, Amar Rabbi, the Rav Yosef is source number 12. Rabbi Yehuda Damar Srach Tvila Hizo, Chotetz o Eino Chotetz. So does the din of chatzitza, an intervening object, let's say you went in with clothing, the pants were still on, would an intervening object passel the Tvila and require that you do it again, or no? The reason you would think it would is because that's what Tvila requires, that the entire body be submerged and be directly within the water with no intervening object. So as Rashi says, would you say that therefore it should be chotzetz, right? That you should have to do the tefillah again? Or do we say no, eino chotzetz? Why? Rashi explains, because odilma kevan de eina ba'a ela lahaskira al tuma yishana, since the whole purpose of it is just a precaution to raise his consciousness. Perhaps at some point he really was tameh and never was mitaher from his tumah. V'lo the tariba, it's not actually meant to purify him. Lo pasaba chatzitza. So you don't need to have a psul chatzitza. It's enough. Let him submerge himself in the water, and if it turns out that he still has a chatzitza, it doesn't matter. The purpose of the takana was achieved. So does the din of tefillah that you can't have a chatzitza, does that apply here? And the Gemara responds, source number 12, Amarle, called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa tikun. It could be to achieve the purpose of the takana, you don't need to have chatzitza poselas. But when the rabbanan are mitakin tefillah, so they follow the pattern and mold of the deoraisa concept, and in as much as the deoraisa concept of tefillah entails not only submerging oneself in, but also having no intermediate intervening object between the body and the water, so too the derabanan tefillah that's required is also going to require that, and chatzitza will be posel called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa tikun. Another example, I'll just say it outside, is hafrashos masros for minim that are only chayav min derabanan. So let's say you have two minim which are, let's say, yirakos, so chuliyama, vegetables are only chayav in masros min derabanan. So you have Chazal required, let's say you take you have to take out masros from tomatoes in order to exempt the requirement for hafrasha. So you need to take it only out of the vegetable itself, its own min. Min HaTorah, this is true for the grains that are chayav min HaTorah, midrabanan. This is the Gemara's question. Can I take out, let's say, tomatoes, hafrashos masos? I have all these vegetables. Like I take out hafrashos masos from just tomatoes, let's say, and exempt my obligation of hafrasha from let's say all the vegetables, a variety of vegetables that I have. So I have cucumbers and I have tomatoes. Can I take out of the total volume of this 10%, let's say, of the tomatoes and have that count as being mafresh from these vegetables? This is what's known as being mafresh min al she'eino mino. I mean, I'm taking out from a particular species of produce and exempting the other produce, the other species. Is that a problem or not? Min HaTorah, we don't. It's not allowed based on various libudim. We don't allow this for hafrashas, trumos, and ma'asos min HaTorah. But for something which is only chayav min derabanan anyway, min HaTorah, you don't need to be mafresh at all. So are we makbid that you need to be mafresh min amino, or is min al she'eino amino good enough? And the Gemara explains you need to do it min al amino. Why? The Gemara explains, called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa takinu, ma de'oraisa shnei minin enan misasin mizeh al zeh derabanan nami. Right, so it could be that this is only a din derabanan, it's a creation of the rabbanan, but nonetheless it has to follow the model of the Torah. So given this principle called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa tikun, the question that we can ask now on HaOmer is the second question. Not only, why would you just leave out the shvuos? What does that save you exactly? But also, how can you leave out shvuos? Isn't it the case called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa tikun? Indeed, that the Gra, in formulating the position, explaining the position of Abaye according to these Tosfos, right, that Abaye agrees that it's derabanan, but he disagrees, he can only count days, emphasizes this point. Afshi derabanan mikamakam called the tikun rabbanan ke'en deraisa tikun. So that's the question the second question on this position of HaOmer. Towards a potential solution. So I'm going to start to answer this question by expanding it a little bit. It's noticeable that in the original mitzvah instituted Zechel Mikdash, there similar patterns emerge, similar problems emerge. The original mitzvah instituted Zechel Mikdash was by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai at the times of the Churban, as Rabbi Harrigan spoke about. He was the great Chacham, the greatest Chacham of the era. So the Mishnah in Sukkah notes that there's a mitzvah, there's Min Torah, there's mitzvahs lulav, both in Gvulin. 5 minutes? Okay. You know what? I think I'll just have to skip the whole section. I don't have broad shoulders, and so even though the person we're commemorating, Rav Lichtenstein, might have ignored it, and his great Talmud of Rosenzweig ignored it following through, I guess I'm going to have to pay heed to it. So basically, just outside, you find the same pattern regarding lulav b'mikdash, that there's a mitzvah deraisa of lulav b'gvulin on the first day, and then the rest of the days that we carry the lulav is midrabanan zechel mikdash. The Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was mitakin midrabanan zechel mikdash, that lulav nitel b'medina kol shiva, to commemorate the mitzvah deraisa that applied b'mikdash kol shiva. In other words, the mitzvah min Torah was outside of Mikdash, you take the lulav one day, and in Mikdash, take lulav all 7 days. The Mishnah says, Hitkin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that lulav would be nital everywhere, all 7 days, to commemorate Mikdash. The Gemara provides, in source number 15, the Gemara provides the makor for this concept of Zechel Mikdash. In as much as this is the first, the Gemara says, where do we get it from that we should do this concept of Zechel Mikdash? Where do we know this is important from? Rabbi Yochanan was medayik, says the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was medayik from the pasuk. Tzion hi darash in la, the pasuk in Yirmiyah, that she's Tzion, nobody seeks her. Nobody seeks her out. Darash in la michlada ba'yadrisha. We need to seek her out. This is the diuk that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made. Therefore, it's right to appoint to be instituting Zechel Mikdash. In lulav 2, you find various psulim that only apply the first day, deraisa, and do not apply, Chazal say that it's sufficient for the derabanan days that follow, right? So for instance, you don't need to own it. You need to own it the first day, you don't need to own it the subsequent days. An esrog, which is chaser, which is missing a chunk of it, is puzzle the first day, but Chazal said it's perfectly usable the second days. In fact, the Gemara proves this from Rabbi Chanina, who used to eat his esrog and then be yotzei mevarech. And the Gemara explains it's not a problem. Rabbi Chanina was doing this for the second days when there's no such issue. So the question becomes, and Rishonim asked this there as well, what happened to Madi Tikkun Rabbanan called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikkun? So I'd like to suggest to resolve these difficulties that regarding the second question, called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikkun, so the idea we could build off of is a limitation in this klal that is articulated in the Gemara in Gittin. Again, I'm not going to time, I just have to say it outside. Basically, the Gemara Gittin says that the principle called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikkun applies only to takanos which are b'milsa de islay ikar min Torah. Takanos which are in effect expansions of mitzvahs shel Torah. So if you have a mitzvah of tvila midaraisa, and then you're applying that mitzvah in places where min Torah it's not required, you have to do it fully. You have to transfer the model that exists min Torah to the derabanan application as well. But if it's a takana, which is in a sense sort of a ex nihilo creation concept of the Rabbanan, so then they're not bound by called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikkun. And we can suggest that perhaps the takanos of Zechel Mikdash follow this pattern, and the idea would be that when Chazal were mitaking mitzvah sfira, when Chazal were mitaking mitzvah netila Zechel Mikdash, they weren't obligating us in mitzvahs netilas lulav in a place where the Torah wasn't. They weren't obligating us mitzvahs sfira in a place where the Torah wasn't. The mitzvah is a mitzvah of Zechiras Mikdash, a mitzvah of Drishat Sion. The Rabbanan came along and said, we're mechayiv you, there's a mitzvah to be Doresh Sion, to be Zocher Mikdash, and the way you do that is by doing things that were done in the Mikdash, in the context of the Mikdash. When in the Mikdash you used to do this, the Mikdash used to do that, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saw Doresh Sion needs Drisha, we need to institute the aspiration for Tzion, so we're mechayiv you to do things that were done in the Mikdash. But inasmuch as then it's not an expansion of the mitzvah lulav min Torah, it's an entirely new creation of the Rabbanan called the mitzvah of Zechiras Mikdash, or mitzvah of Drishas Tzion, so then it's not an Isla Ikar min Torah, and therefore it's not bound by the rules, by the limitations of Kol Tikun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikun. So that would, in effect, allow for there to be a deviation from the principle, the model deraisa of Netilas Lulav and model deraisa of Sefirat HaOmer, right? That we don't need to follow the deraisa principle because the mitzvah is not really a mitzvah of Sefira or mitzvah of Netila. It's a mitzvah of Zechiras Mikdash, something which is entirely the unique creation of the Rabbanan. And then, as far as the first question is concerned, I would suggest as follows. I mean, the question, so that allows them to deviate. But why don't we just do what the model of the Torah? Why don't we just do the mitzvah of Sefiras Yamim and Shavuos? And here, maybe we could suggest that the idea given that Zecher Mikdash, this notion of being Zocher, of commemorating Mikdash, is rooted in Drishas Tzion, the pasuk of Dorish Tzion Hi Dorish Ein La, perhaps we can argue that the idea of being Dorish something, of seeking it out, starts with a recognition that it isn't present at the moment. You have to sense the absence in order to aspire for the presence. If one continues to act as if the Mikdash were here, so then that's in a sense not the aspiration for Tzion. That's simply the complacence. That's simply the pretending or ignoring the Mikdash. If the Rabbanan were to say Zecher Mikdash, you do exactly the day after Mikdash that you did before Mikdash, so in effect you can kind of undermine and defeat the whole purpose of this takana Zecher Mikdash. You're not going to be Doresh Tzion anymore. To be Doresh Tzion needs to start with the feeling of absence. And if I have the exact same thing and I did before, after, that isn't felt. So for that reason, it wasn't just that it was illicit to deviate from the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein Deraisa Tikun. It had to be that you felt the absence, the deficiency. I think this would explain both Sefiras Yamim and Shavuos. This also explain something that the Meiri points out. He asked the question, how could Rabbi Chanina eat his esrog? What kind of, I mean, even somebody less than that, you'd say, if you saw a kid, you'd say, don't eat the esrog, you're going to be using that for your mitzvah. Oh, it's okay, it's the second day, but it's not, it's not good. I think he gives a different answer. One can suggest that maybe this was Rabbi Chanina's way of really concretizing that absence of Mikdash that is essential for there to be a Drishas Tzion. In my concluding remark, that's the Shiur part. In my concluding remark, I'll just note that I think this is appropriate as a tribute to Rav Lichtenstein because Rav Lichtenstein emphasized this notion of aspiration. It wasn't just Dorish Tzion. He was Dorish Tzion in Pshudik Mashmo, went out and made a home in Tzion when it was much less popular than it is today. But just broadly speaking, the notion of aspiring for an ideal, of reaching towards an ideal, was something that he viewed as crucial, and he communicated to us. He quoted approvingly the statement to the effect from John Stuart Mill that just pragmatically speaking, a student from whom it is never demanded to do what he cannot will never do what he can. Something to that effect. And that's in terms of pragmatically just getting the most out of somebody. He also felt that it was just crucial for a person spiritually to be constantly reaching. He quoted Stuart Mill's contemporary. The biographical knowledge is literally just from Rav Lichtenstein's speech where he quoted these things. His contemporary, Robert Browning, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, else what's the heavens for? He viewed that as essential to man generally, and particularly in terms of Avodas Hashem, he stressed it as well. And here I'll just quote one particular Rambam, which he noted a problem and then gave an illuminating and characteristic answer. The Rambam in source number 23, this will be very brief, it's just one makor and a half. The Rambam in source number 23 speaks about somebody who's Oved Me'ava, who serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of love. And he speaks about what this entails. It entails somebody who has absolutely no ulterior motive of any kind whatsoever. He simply serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu because it's the emes, it's the truth. Osa emes v'bnei shehu ha'emes. All the rewards that the Torah speaks about, spiritual, financial, familial, all these things, those are secondary. Those are not the reason to do. That's not the motivation. That's not why a person does it. The Rambam notes that this is not an easy thing to achieve. It's exceedingly difficult. Umala zo, he says, himala gedola ma'od, by which he means it's very difficult. Vein kol chacham zochalo. Not even every wise person. For the Rambam, the wise person, of course, represents somebody who's not just intellectually gifted, but also somebody who is spiritually, emotionally, very He's at the peak of his powers, but not even every such person is going to be zocha to this achievement, to this degree of ahava. This is what was unique about Avram Avinu. V'himas Avram Avinu shekara Kadosh Baruch Hu ava lefi shelo avad el me'ava. And then the Rambam writes, V'hi hamala shetzivanu ba Kadosh Baruch Hu aydei Moshe shenem arav d'Hashem l'kecha. Strikingly, the Rambam goes from speaking about something which is so difficult, and not even every chacham is zochela, and this is what made Avram Avinu so special, and this is what we're commanded to achieve. This is what we're commanded. And the question which Rav Wilkinson poses is obvious. How can this exceedingly difficult achievement be something which is meant for every single one of us? How does HaKadosh Baruch Hu command us to achieve that which is very, very hard to do? And the Rav Wilkinson's answer was, I say characteristic. He suggested that as a feat to be achieved, this ava is relevant to very few. But as a value to be cultivated, as an ideal to aspire for, a vision to work towards, this is a lot of everybody. This is what we're all commanded to do. I think if you look at the Rambam Peish Mishnah, you find that that's very consistent with what the Rambam describes there. May the memory of Rav Wilkinson, the vision that he provided us of Ma'ashem Shoel Meimach, even as it's impossible for any of us to achieve it, but maybe we be inspired to work towards it. Thank you very much.